So in this video, we're going to look at the book of Nahum. So let's get right to it and answer our 8 questions. So when we think about who wrote the book, it was Nahum, and he identifies himself in chapter 1, verse 1, an oracle concerning Nineveh, the book of visions of Nahum. So he identifies himself right off the bat. So when we think about who it was written to Judah. So remember, the kingdom had split, and you had Israel in the south, Israel in the north and Judah in the south, but it was written to that southern kingdom, Judah, and it was to comfort them about Nineveh, which was the capital city of Assyria, and that was their enemies that had been very cruel to them through the years. So, and that's also found in verse 1, an oracle concerning Nineveh. So if you haven't listened to the video that I did on Jonah, go ahead and listen to that either after this one or stop this one and go listen to Jonah, because really Nahum is kind of like a sequel or part 2 to Jonah. So I won't go into a lot of detail, but since I've already recorded one on Jonah, but Jonah went to Nineveh and preached there, and they repented. Well, some 100 plus years have passed with the writing of Nahum. So that leads us to the question of how much time is covered. And with it being just a short book of prophecy, there's really not a lot of events that are chronicled. So it's really hard to tell how much time is covered of him writing it, if that makes sense. But what we do know is that Nineveh fell in 612 BC. So that's when the prophecies from this book were fulfilled. So we know it had to be written before 612 BC, and most people think it was written around 713 BC. Okay, when we think about the main idea, I'm going to read the little excerpt from House to House that I've been reading other times with the minor prophets. It says, Nahum is a sequel to Jonah. The latter prophet, that being Jonah, had warned of Nineveh's impending doom, but the Assyrians had repented and been spared temporarily. Nahum, a century and a half later, announces the nation's overthrow. So that's it in a nutshell. Nineveh is going to be destroyed. And another main idea is that God's enemies are always going to be trampled at some point. They're not just going to be able to get away with it forever. When we think about notable characters, really the Lord is the main character in the book. And then if you want to consider a nation a character or a city, it would be Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria. When we think about notable events, again, with it not being like a history account, with it being prophecy, there's really not events that can be noted. But I wanted to share with you an outline. So chapter 1, the doom is declared on Nineveh. In chapter 2, the doom is described. And then in chapter 3, he's going to tell them why that punishment is due. Why are you expecting all these bad things to happen to you? Okay, when we think about where on the timeline, it was during the divided kingdom. So we referred to that at the beginning of the video. When we think about Jesus in the book, none just jump out at me. So I'm not going to try to force something. I know that there's probably some there for people that are more scholarly than me, and maybe you have seen some in your reading of Nahum. When we think about why study Nahum, there's a couple of reasons. And the first one being that collapse can come quickly. So remember, when Jonah went and preached, they repented. So that generation right there repented, and everything was good, and there was no impending doom. It was taken away. But somewhere along the way, and this would probably have been maybe 2 generations, 1 generation away, they didn't do what their mamas and daddies had done. So really, we're just 1 generation away from apostasy. So that's why it's so important for this generation to be teaching the next generation that's coming up the way to follow God. Also, chapters 1, verses 2 and 3 gives us a very balanced view of God, and I'm just going to read that to you. The Lord is jealous, and he's an avenging God. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries and keeps wrath for his enemies. So, wow, a lot of times we don't really think about that side of God. But then in verse 3, the Lord is slow to anger and great in power. Okay, so that's, we a lot of times we do stress that. We like to think about that part. But then here it is again. And the Lord will by no means clear the guilty. So God's just not going to turn away from the guilty, and he's going to punish people, but he is slow to anger. So he's going to give you lots of time to repent, but we don't want to run out of time. We want to make sure we repent before we do run out of time, because eventually all of us will, run out of time. Then also in chapter 1, verse 5, gives us some of that figurative language that we find a lot of times in the prophets in the Old Testament. It says the mountains quake before him, the hills melt, the earth heaves before him, and the world and all who dwell in it. So literally the mountains aren't shaking, the hills are not melting, and the earth is not heaving. So that's, again, figurative language that's found throughout all the New Testament, especially in the prophets, and that's really going to help us understand Revelation when we get there. So I hope this has been helpful. It's a very short book. It's just 3 short chapters. You could read it easily in one sitting, but again, it can be difficult just because of the nature of prophecy. So another thing, always remember what you're reading when you pick up to read a book. If it's history, if it's poetry, or if in this case prophecy, it's not going to read like history or poetry.